Hello and welcome to the latest episode of IMTV. My name is Adam Booth. I'm your host for tonight. I'm the editor of Socialist.net, which is the website of Socialist Appeal, the British section of the IMT. And it's IMT that brings you IMTV, that's the International Marxist Tendency, a revolutionary organisation, a Marxist organisation active in around 40 different countries. And tonight we're going to be speaking in a minute with the editor of Socialist Revolution, the paper of our American organization, the American section of the IMT. If you want to find out more, you can visit socialistrevolution.org, I believe. And this is John Peterson, who is the editor, as I say. And John is joining us from New York live. Hi, John. You can hear us okay?
Yeah. Hi, Adam. How you doing? Hi, everybody. Nice to be here.
You safe and healthy there?
Yes, as best as we can. It's a bit hectic sometimes, but the epicenter of this thing is pretty nuts. But yeah, we're all doing okay so far.
Great, and I think that's a good place to start us off tonight. Obviously, talking about the COVID-19 crisis and the fact that, as you say, America is high up there now. I think it's the highest in terms of the death count, and New York in particular is as you say, the epicenter really of this crisis on a world scale in terms of the number of deaths and incidences. So can you describe for us a little bit, to start us off, the mood in New York amongst ordinary people?
Well, New York is, by many accounts, the capital of the world, the city that never sleeps. New York is a place that has millions of visitors every year. There's millions of people who live outside of the city itself that work, come every day into the city to work. And all of that is basically shut down. It's really astonishing, the transformation that you see in the city. There's an atmosphere of fear. There's an atmosphere of anxiety. As many as 30% of the workers in New York City have lost their jobs already. We've got the largest number of deaths in the country, definitely, and fast approaching worldwide, if not already, just in New York City, let alone the country, with over 5,000 deaths in New York State, I believe, so far, and over 4,000 in the city, and thousands of infections. And the real scale of the infection rate is vastly underreported. I know lots of people who have symptoms who have been told by their doctors that they probably have COVID-19, and yet they have not been tested, so they're not formally counted. Same goes with the deaths. I just saw something that the death rate, the rate of people dying in their homes in New York City is 10 times higher than normal right now, and yet many of those deaths aren't being tested. There aren't being autopsies done, and they're likely also caused by this virus, and they're not counted. So it really is something else to behold.
And as you said, a lot of this is this mood of uncertainty created by the fact that there's not tests, and also exacerbated by the way in which governments are flip-flopping. And I think there's definitely a similarity, it seems, between the attitude of the Tories here in Britain, where I'm sitting here today, and this constant kind of flip-flopping from one position to another creates a lot of uncertainty for ordinary people. They seem to be kind of dragging their heels, constantly behind the curve when it comes to enacting lockdowns, often seeming quite flippant, quite complacent about these questions, dragging their heels, as I say. And Trump seems to really be, showing the lead in this respect, kind of having a kind of joking attitude, calling it the China virus, not implementing measures. What is the government doing, or rather not doing, in terms of this crisis?
Well, yeah, as you say, it's been an absolute disaster, frankly, for working people. A patchwork of responses, different responses depending on the mood of the president, depending on the mood or the partisan affiliation of this or that governor or mayor of the country. In New York City, for example, Mayor de Blasio who was allegedly, a progressive champion, is obviously an agent of Wall Street that is based in the city. And, he waited till the very last minute to shut down the schools, which was a major, vector for transmission of this virus. Over 1 million school children in New York City. It was only once the opposition current in the teachers union came out and said that they were going to have a mass sick-in, and they were expecting as many as 60% or more of teachers not to show up the following Monday, that he finally shut things down. But then all of that, of course, has a knock-on effect on everybody else, because if your kids can't go to school or to daycare, you can't really do that either. So by degrees, things got shut down, but it's very clear that it was delayed response. At the state level, of course, Governor Andrew Cuomo, a sort of classic liberal bourgeois who sees himself as a kind of modern day FDR, has risen to some national prominence, because he's had a very different kind of attitude than Trump, but obviously still very much positioning himself ultimately to defend the interests of private property, the interests of the capitalists, and he understands, of course, that there's social dangers to a bad response, not just economic dangers, not just health dangers. And so he's a little bit more clever, but Donald Trump, absolutely, for mocking this thing, from saying that it was under control, from saying that there's no problem whatsoever. Maybe not quite as bad as Boris Johnson with his whole herd immunity quips, but a pretty bad approach. Now his main concern seems to be to shift the blame from how early on he was actually warned that this could be a dangerous pandemic, to finding other people to scapegoat. Another person in the government that's come to some prominence is Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's one of the top experts in this field, and he has, as diplomatically as possible, clashed with the president on various topics. And it's very clear that there is no clear response. It's very clear that, Trump said that he was going to have America open for business again by Easter. He very quickly had to backtrack on that, because it was very clear that if they hadn't flattened the curve more by then, it would just explode exponentially, and we'd have tens of millions more infections and millions more deaths. So there is no coherent response. It's all about politics. It's all about blaming different people. Trump is now blaming the World Health Organization for not acting early enough, even though it declared this emergency much earlier than he did. So yeah, it is a mess, and this is obviously causing a lot of consternation, to say the least, because people are very, very worried about their personal health, about their families, about their jobs, and about the economy as a whole, which is also melting down in the midst of all of this.
Well, can we go into that a bit more then, this question of the economy? Because obviously Donald Trump is billionaire, big business president, similar again to Boris Johnson over in the UK on this front. And what we've seen in the UK and elsewhere is governments obviously, pumping huge amounts of money into the economy to kind of prop up the system, basically to keep it alive. And America is the belly of the beast when it comes to capitalism, world capitalism. So what America does, they always say, if America catches a cold, the rest of the world sneezes, or rather the other way around, if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And that must be the case now, right? What America's doing with the economy will have an impact not only on working people in America, but across the world. So what is the American government and the Fed doing at this time to try and prop up the economy and to deal with, as you say, this massive spike in unemployment that we're seeing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the United States doesn't just have a sneeze now; it's got COVID-19. I mean, it's a dramatic, very dangerous disease, and it is going to have repercussions throughout the rest of the world. Anybody who thought that any particular country could somehow decouple from the rest of the world economy is going to be in for a real shock, because the world is more integrated than ever, and world crisis of the economy, world crisis of a pandemic is a world crisis, and ultimately that's going to lead, as I can speak about a little bit more later on, to a worldwide fight back by the working class and ultimately worldwide socialist revolution. But in the immediate sense, on the question of the economy, I mean, over the course of 2 weeks, you had nearly 10 million people lose their jobs. That's more than the total job losses of the entire 2008-2009 Great Recession, as they called it, within just 2 weeks. I mean, this is the biggest economic calamity, the jobs lost. And that's just the the official ones that have been recorded. Lots of people couldn't even get through to the state websites. Lots of people aren't even counted because they're maybe working part-time instead of full-time before, and some of the new legislations allows them to claim benefits, but it's not that easy to even get through or get set
So,
up.
so
And of
what is
course,
that legislation, John? What are they doing to address this? Because I mean, and also, how does
yeah.
this compare to the Great Depression in terms of the unemployed?
Sure. Well, I mean, in terms of, I mean, the absolute numbers, I think, and the percentages of unemployed could very well get up to the levels of the Great Depression. And if you look at the standards of living of ordinary workers, the vast majority of workers in this country are in the service industry with low wages. They don't have much savings. It's having a huge impact. And so the government, of course, has used this as an opportunity to pass several packages of aid, as they call it, or supporting the economy. And the biggest one, of course, is the $2 trillion act, that was the CARE Act, as they call it, which was passed 10 days or so ago, which basically out of those $2 trillion, $250 million are going to go out in these one-time checks, $1,200 per person, that are supposed to sort of shore people's basically allow them to pay the rent. And then another 250,000 is going to be to expand the unemployment benefits that the different states already offer by offering a supplement onto that. But the vast bulk of that money is going directly towards big corporations, towards Wall Street, towards the airlines, towards manufacturers. And if you look at it, ultimately, even the money that is going to shore up the unemployment and things like that, or it's just going to go ultimately towards the landlords, towards the banks to pay off credit card bills, to pay off the rent and mortgages. And even though there are some moratoriums on paying some of these things in some places and to some degree, eventually that's all going to come due, and it's going to be again a huge catastrophe for ordinary working people. And it's the biggest money grab probably by the time this is over in U.S. history, which is saying something, because going back to the founding of the United States, that's how the great fortunes of this country have been made. You may have seen that Trump actually just signed an order that removes the oversight of how this money is spent. And so it's not even clear who's gonna decide who's gonna get what. He ultimately will be the final, have the final say. And just to put this into context, all of the credit card debt in the United States and all of the student debt in the United States, two of the biggest forms of debt in this country, together add up to about $2 trillion. In other words, enough money has been spent now, came out of nowhere, that they're basically printing money, by the way. They're just making up this money, is now all of a sudden available, whereas it could have written off all these debts for working people, for the entire working class of the entire country. Everybody could have had those debts written off. But they said, of course, they didn't have money for that. They needed the money. Of course, it's all ways to keep working people tied into the system, forced to go to work, forced to pay off these loans and debts, and therefore unable to get as active in the class struggle.
And people have said, some people have joked that Trump is bringing in universal basic income because he's giving everyone a check in the post. Is that the reality of what he's doing?
Well, I mean, if it were to continue indefinitely, and maybe you could make that joke a little bit more. But honestly, it's a desperate measure to try to stop the absolute hemorrhaging of the mortgage industry, the housing industry, the credit card companies. It's ultimately all going to go right back into the banks of those big banks, right into the accounts of those big banks and the big mortgage holders, and ultimately he's paying the wages for the companies. The state is using tax dollar revenues, because eventually it's going to have to be paid back, either in the form of higher taxes or through inflationary pressure on the economy, to pay the wages for the employers. So it's a sort of nationalization of debt, and privatization of the public wealth. Robin Hood in reverse, as a lot of people call it.
Definitely, definitely. And you mentioned there before as well about the fact that a lot of workers are being forced still to go into work. Obviously, there are essential industries. There's the healthcare system. That's obviously we need workers going to these places. But across the world, we've seen waves of strikes against the bosses who are trying to force workers to go into places that clearly aren't essential production. Have you seen a similar kind of movement of militant action or walkouts in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. This crisis has revealed to the whole world which kind of workers and which kind of humans and the jobs that they do are really essential in this society towards keeping things going, whether it's the healthcare workers, of course, transportation, communications, grocery store workers, delivery workers, millions of largely low paid, very precariously employed people are now on the front lines of this, and of course endangering their health, endangering their families every time they go out, yet they have no option to do it. I would say that the biggest response so far among workers has been amongst that layer of the working class. It's not so much those workers that are being forced to continue non-essential production. It's people in Amazon warehouses. It's people in grocery stores. It's delivery drivers. So far recorded, there's been at least over 35 different wildcat strikes or walkouts or threats of strikes. Bus drivers, all kinds of different people, hospital workers, and of course the bosses try to paint these workers as greedy and they don't care about your well-being and blah blah blah, when the bottom line is that they can see that if they're not healthy, if they're not given protections, if they're not given extra pay, frankly, so that they can work these long hours, it's going to lead to the breakdown of the whole of society. And so we can't accept this lie that these workers are somehow, hospital workers, for example, nurses that are so overwhelmed they can't care for the people that they're supposed to keep alive, when they say we demand more staff, and then the bosses tell them to leave. The real enemies of public health and the health of the working class is the bosses. It's the capitalist system, which wants to keep the profits rolling at all costs.
And that's a good point also, to talk about the healthcare system in the US and the impact of that, because obviously here in Britain we've got an NHS that's nominally at least publicly owned. It's been privatized, it's been outsourced, and there's been a massive decline in the number of hospital beds per person over the last few decades. But in America, you've obviously got famously a private healthcare system with medical insurance, big companies kind of making lots of profit out of healthcare, and even Trump wanted to, get his hands on the NHS and give American big business access to our healthcare system as well. So, how has the healthcare system in America responded to this crisis, and has it been able to deal with it? Have the private healthcare providers exacerbated this crisis?
Absolutely. In many ways, the United States has, one of the best healthcare systems in the world, if you can afford it. And there's obviously huge differences in outcomes. If you get infected with this disease, whether you're poor or whether you're rich, whether you have access to good quality healthcare or whether you don't. People are dying because they're being turned away at the emergency rooms because they don't have health insurance, and they literally die. This kind of thing happens all the time, but this is really bringing this to the forefront. Obviously, the ordinary doctors and nurses and nurses' aides and staff and everybody that makes these things run are real frontline heroes of the working class, keeping people alive and everything. But and they're making huge efforts, huge sacrifices. But the stories of people having to sew their own homemade masks because these mega profit-making hospital systems don't have enough masks, or the government didn't stockpile enough. The number of beds have been cut down, the same here over the years. The number of ventilators, the so-called federal emergency stockpile has been basically looted over the decades of funding to be able to respond to something like this. And of course, Trump and people like that say, oh, nobody could have predicted anything like this happened. It came out of the blue. Whereas, a lot of people, even within the administration, were warning very early on that this was a very clear possibility. So the healthcare system is under terrible strain. Places like New York City, they're talking about using refrigeration units in nearby farms, or even using parks around New York City or in the city itself as makeshift morgues or even burial grounds for people if things continue the way they have in the last period. So it's completely overwhelmed. The health insurance middleman that makes billions of dollars, and the United States, we end up spending more per capita on healthcare than most other advanced industrialized countries, and yet millions of people still don't have healthcare, and it's because of those middlemen. And so there's obviously calls for things like Medicare for all by some, But what that would ultimately would do, it would leave the entire healthcare system in private hands. And instead of having people pay a private insurer, the government would pay those premiums, would pay those for those expenses to the private industry. So we're against that. We're for a genuine socialized healthcare system, nationalized, run under democratic public control by the workers in those workplaces, with free healthcare, high quality healthcare at the point of service for everybody. Similar to the NHS, but fully funded and expanded and so on.
Definitely. And I think that's a good place to talk about the political situation in America. Before we get on to that, though, I just want to remind everyone, obviously, this is a live broadcast. And if you're following on Facebook or YouTube, you can post your comments and questions for John in the chats there. And we'll have time for questions in a few minutes. So get typing if you'd like to ask John a particular question. But John, as I said, we should talk about the political situation in America, because obviously this comes in an election year where Donald Trump will be seeking re-election, and his candidate, his rival candidate now will be, we found out today, Joe Biden, confirmed because of the dropout of Bernie Sanders. He's announced he's dropping out of the race, and Bernie obviously has been, very prominent with his campaign, particularly around demands like Medicare for all, as you say. But what is the situation now politically? Why has Bernie dropped out? And what does it, what's the perspective for the left around Bernie, this massive movement, this big campaign that he's built up?
Yeah, no, breaking news really just in the last couple hours. Bernie has officially announced that he's not going to be running for president anymore. Bernie played by the game of the Democratic Party, and he agreed to play by rules that were rigged against someone like him. He ended up in a situation where all the other candidates coalesced around Joe Biden. We've explained how this sort of process took place, especially after the South Carolina primaries and after some other important wins that Biden had in some other states. Basically, a path to victory for Bernie as a Democrat was ruled out. Unfortunately, we've argued since 2016 that Sanders should have run as an independent. Sanders should have used his campaign and the mass enthusiasm and the big expectations that people had to fight for basic things like healthcare for all and higher minimum wage for all and things like that, in order to lay the foundations for a different kind of party, a new party, a mass workers' party. We would argue a party that requires a socialist program, a revolutionary socialist program, ultimately, in order to go beyond the limits of capitalism and begin attacking the real root of all the problems that working Americans, workers of the world, all face. So right now, it's hard to say what's going to happen. A lot of people on the left said they were Bernie or bust. They said they're not going to support Biden. We'll see what they say now. This is the trap of the two-party system. This is the swamp of the Democratic Party, where people are sucked in. People who want something different, they're sucked in. There's a bait and switch. There's a Pied Piper that brings them into that party, whether it's conscious or unconscious, or cynical or just naive. People like Bernie end up playing that kind of role, and we appeal to all the people who were inspired by Bernie, who wanted to see something different than the status quo politics, who can't imagine voting for someone like Joe Biden with everything that he represents, and obviously aren't going to support Trump either, to begin now to get organized, to educate yourself, and to begin building the embryo of a revolutionary Marxist organization in the United States. Because ultimately, the socialist revolution in the United States is going to be even more transformative than the crisis we're going through now. It's going to mean ultimately the liberation of the whole world. And the time to start building that is yesterday. And I think in the next period, a lot of people are going to be asking questions about what the whole Sanders thing meant. There are probably going to be different attempts to build new parties out of the shambles of the movement that he built. It remains to be seen whether or not he's going to endorse Biden. He said he would in the past, but there's still a chance he could plot an independent course and still call for a break with the Democrats and try to take on both Sanders and Trump. And I know for a fact that millions of people would support such a move. And even if it didn't win the elections this time, would lay the foundations for a real tidal change in U.S. politics in the future.
That's a good place to almost end for tonight. But I just want to ask one more question, which is, flowing from what you've just said, really, the fact that this crisis comes on top of decades of rising inequality, of attacks on the working class in America and internationally, and with this political polarization taking place across the world, and we've seen that obviously with the election of Trump and the movement around Sanders. How do you think this crisis is going to feed into those existing kind of tensions and contradictions? And what do you really see then as the perspective for the class struggle in America, which, as we said, is the belly of the beast? If there's going to be a world revolution, it has to include a revolution in America to overthrow capitalism there. So, what do you see really as the perspectives for the idea of an American revolution, another American revolution in the period ahead?
Well, I think that process has been dramatically accelerated. We saw climate change was already a big accelerator of this process in terms of the consciousness of young people and their understanding of what was possible and what was not possible within the limits of capitalism. I think this whole crisis is shaking up consciousness in a way. I mean, it's like World War II, the Spanish influenza, the 2008 crisis, all at once. I mean, pretty much everything that's happened in the last century is now rolled into one, and that's having a massive effect on people's consciousness. You see the beginnings of the class struggle already with these waves of strikes and so on, unionization drives. That's just the beginning of the beginning. We already saw that building up before the crisis, and let's not believe the lie that everything was going great with the economy before this happened. This was just the accident that triggered the collapse of the whole house of cards of U.S. capitalism. It was a very dramatic trigger and a very unexpected in some ways, but of course Marxists aren't taken by surprise by these kinds of things. We knew that something was going to come along and trigger something like this, and now we see it. So this is going to be a tremendous accelerator. Watch this space. The United States working class has great revolutionary traditions, great traditions of labor struggles, and we're going to see a revival of all of this on a much higher level because the stakes are higher than ever, and it really is socialism or barbarism. Barbarism, is creeping into parts of the United States, and people are seeing that they're going to have to get organized, and that only the working class can resolve this, and we can only rely on our own forces, our own strength, our own ideas, and our own organizations.
Thank you very much, John. I think that's a great place to end. And in terms of talking about organizations, I just want to bring the viewers' attention to the website for the Socialist Revolution, socialistrevolution.org, if I'm not mistaken. And
That's
you
right.
can find there details about, if you're viewing in the US, how to get involved with Socialist Revolution. So visit that, the website today, and obviously lots of articles, analysis, videos, and so forth. And of course, check out, as I've said already, the IMT's Facebook, YouTube channel, Twitter, and so forth. And most importantly, of course, visit Marxist.com if you want to get involved in the IMT across the world in the International Marxist Tendency. So just want to say thanks again, John, for joining us
Thank you.
tonight. We've had lots of compliments on your bookshelf, so it looks like you've got plenty of reading to get through to keep you busy in isolation. So stay safe and healthy, and solidarity to yourself and all the comrades in the USA. Thanks.
Same to you, and compliments on your bookshelf as well. It's even better. Thanks, comrades. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again to John for joining us tonight. Thank you to all the viewers at home. A reminder that IMTV is going to be live broadcast every Wednesday at 6 p.m. UK time. So join us soon for the next week, in fact, for the next episode. And after that, we'll be starting to produce more material in terms of theory and history, and we'll be covering lots of different topics on a regular podcast with authors from Marxist.com, providing excellent analysis and ideas from a Marxist perspective. So stay tuned for more of that as well. And again, follow us on the social media, like and subscribe if you want to get notifications of all of these activities. Thanks again for joining. Next week, we're going to be discussing with our comrades in Pakistan, who are going to be talking to us about the situation in Pakistan, in India, in the Indian subcontinent, So join us for the same for more Marxist analysis and interviews from across the world at the same time, same place next week. We'll see you there. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.